America Walks webinar titled People Over Parking, Advancing Affordable Housing and Walkability Through Parking Reform. My name's Ian Thomas, State and Local Program Director with America Walks. Co-facilitating with me today is Arliss Reynolds, City Council member in Costa Mesa, California, and America Walks board member. Our guest speakers are Minnesota State Senator Omar Fateh, Chair of the Minneapolis Planning Commission, Chris Meyer, and President of the Parking Reform Network, Tony Jordan. As always, we're very grateful to our sponsors, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and their Active People Healthy Nation campaign, EcoCounter, and Tool Design. And you can support our webinars and other programming. If you wish, there's a link to our donations page in the chat stream. If you have any questions for our panelists, please enter them in the Q&A section. And this is also where you can find the closed captioning feature. These are today's webinar objectives. Attendees will learn about the negative impacts of parking mandates on walkability and housing affordability, the current growing momentum of the parking reform movement at the local, state, and federal levels, and ways for advocates to engage with this issue in their own communities. Here are a few minimum parking requirements from the zoning code of any town, USA. Two of the most shocking things about these mandates are how ubiquitous they are and how utterly arbitrary. You'll notice that a bowling alley in this community must have 5 parking spaces per lane, but other cities may require 7 or just 2. There's no science behind these decisions and no evaluation of them. If there were, it would become rapidly clear that almost all of the numbers are too high. As you can see from this photograph, visiting any shopping mall on almost any day of the year, it's clear that these numbers are inflated. In fact, it's primarily because of minimum parking requirements that we have suburban sprawl. The vast acreages of asphalt needed to satisfy city code push destinations further and further apart, making the area unwalkable so everybody drives. And then the roads have to be widened to accommodate all the extra traffic. It's a vicious cycle that has disastrous consequences for safety, health, and the climate. There are also negative economic consequences. The cost of land and labor to create all those parking lots, and in more urban areas, parking structures, adds hundreds of dollars to the monthly rent for a small apartment or business unit, putting them out of reach for many low-income residents and local entrepreneurs. Fortunately, the tide has been turning slowly but surely for quite a while. The idea of parking reform started gathering momentum in 2005 with the publication of The High Cost of Free Parking by urban planning professor Donald Shoup. And this book has become an inspiration for advocates. Our first guest, Chris Meyer, read The High Cost of Free Parking in about 2014, and I'll let him explain why he's standing here with more than 100 copies of the book on this table.
Thank you, Ian. It was actually, I think, in 2010 that I first read Shoup's book, and I wrote an opinion piece in my college newspaper, the Minnesota Daily, and tried to persuade anyone I could about it, because after I read the book, I came to understand that this was one of the biggest things that we could do to reduce carbon pollution, to make housing more affordable, and to change things on a whole lot of other issues as well, like improving health by making it easier for people to be able to walk around and things like that. And so I reflected about how could I get anybody to pay attention to this issue? How could I get them to read about this? And I thought I could start by buying copies of the book from my council members. So I bought 13 copies of The High Cost of Free Parking, one for each Minneapolis council member in 2015. And we got Minneapolis to eliminate parking minimums completely within half a mile around transit stations. And at the time, we were the first city in the whole country to do that. But then very quickly, a lot of other cities started copying us. And then we went even further. And in 2021, we eliminated parking minimums completely citywide. And I just want to show a couple graphs about what happened when we did that. So this chart here shows the number of parking spots built per unit from 2011 to 2023. And what you see here is on this end, it was usually around one parking spot per unit. And then in 2015, when we eliminated the parking minimums around transit stations, it started to go down. And then in 2021, we had a shift in policy where instead of treating extra parking as a positive benefit, our policy shift to treat it as a nuisance, because we recognized that when more parking is built, that is causing more traffic to happen. That's one of the key things that we keep trying to educate people about. And when people come to the Minneapolis Planning Commission, that they often say like they want more parking because they want to reduce traffic, and a lot of people still have in their heads that if we have more parking, that will reduce traffic, but it doesn't. Studies clearly demonstrate that having more parking is going to drive more traffic to happen. So if we want to reduce our vehicle miles traveled, we have to push for less. So starting in 2021, we changed our policies and are now actively trying to disincentivize people from building extra parking. And then this chart here also shows the same data in a different way. The key things to get from this are that first, moving from here to here is a substantial reduction in parking, and that's something really worth fighting for. It means over time, millions of dollars less spent on that, which substantially reduces housing costs. And it means tons of carbon reduced. But on the flip side, it also shows that the builders are going to build a certain amount of parking, and they're the ones who are best situated to know how much they need. And when we get rid of the minimums, even when we're encouraging them to build a lot less, they're still building quite a lot. So yeah, I was fortunate to be on the Minneapolis Planning Commission when we eliminated the parking minimums. I'm now the president of the Minneapolis Planning Commission, and we're continuing to push policies to try to reduce the amount of parking built. We have what's called a TDM policy, a travel demand management policy, that actively encourages builders to pursue other ideas. Like if they have a big project, they have to get 6 TDM points, and they can get all those points if they provide free public transit passes for their residents. They can get 1 point if they have a screen that shows when the next bus is coming and things like that. So we are really shifting in that direction, and that's what we need to do to take climate action seriously. At the state legislature, Minnesota has invested a tremendous amount in public transit. We made a historic investment, more than we've ever done before last year. But in order to make good use of that, we need to allow projects to be built with fewer parking spots. So, that's what really made me get into this. And A couple of years ago, I started a new job working as the legislative assistant for Senator Omar Fateh. And I thought, maybe I should try to do the same thing for the legislature. So I spent $3,000 buying more than 100 copies of the high cost of free parking and have been giving them out. And it's made a pretty big difference. We've had a number of legislators, staffers, council members who have actually been reading the book. And I've had a few legislators tell me, like, I'll support your bill if you don't make me read it. So it's also had an impact that way. But yeah, so when I first started the job, I had a conversation with my boss and said that I thought that this was a good issue that we could take on. Senator Fateh had campaigned a lot on climate action and housing affordability. So I brought up the idea to him, and he took it on with gusto, and we brought forward the Minnesota People Over Parking Act. And I'll turn it over to Senator Fateh to tell more about that story and where that's at in the legislative process.
Thank you so much, Chris. Although I wouldn't use the word boss, I'll say partner in this. You've been phenomenal, so I appreciate that. And thank you all so much. I'll be honest, when Chris first brought this issue of parking reform to my attention, I didn't know much about it. I was like, parking and housing and climate, what are you talking about? But once he explained more about the importance of it, it was really clear that it was an issue that matters for a lot of the goals that I campaigned on. In Minnesota, we're trying to reduce as much as we can our total vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, and parking minimums are something that we're completely against it, pushing it up instead of down. One of the other goals that I had when I came into office was to do everything I could to bring housing costs down. When I learned that the average parking space in Minneapolis costs over $40,000 to build, I was shocked. That was something that I couldn't imagine. And I remember telling Chris that we shouldn't be forcing people to pay that, and we should give them the option instead to decide for themselves whether or not they need it. And we should be prioritizing building housing for people and not building housing for cars. And I remember mentioning that also in committee. This year we didn't get the bill across the finish line, unfortunately, but we made some really important progress on it. We got it through state and local government and the Senate side, which is a really important first step on its own. And I believe personally that if it came to a vote, we would have probably had the votes to pass it in the full Senate. I don't think we had that yet in the House, or I'm not sure if we do. So that I think is really where the work is going to lie ahead for us. But everything I can do between now and January, I'll do my part in working to make sure it does happen. Again, we did have a lot of great conversations, not just with our caucus, but folks across the aisle, working with folks like Senator Jordan Rasmussen and Senator Draheim, getting their ideas and opinions and getting them on board with this. This is one of the most bipartisan bills, I think, that was worked on this session that we were really proud about. And now with that, I'll turn it over to Tony Jordan, who is the president of the Parking Reform Network, who has been leading on this cause, and he's been a tremendous asset and very valuable as we've been working on this bill. So Tony, take it away.
One second. Okay. Need to share my screen one more time. Thank you so much for the intro. Hold on, something happened here. One sec. Apologies for this slight delay. Okay. I think, boy, still not shared, right? Comes back. Okay. I think we're shared now. Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. Tony Jordan, president of the Parking Reform Network in Portland, Oregon. And we're going to talk about parking for a little bit here, reinforce some of what we heard and maybe provide some new information. So we're talking about the parking problem. This is not necessarily, there wasn't a space exactly where you wanted or that you didn't want to pay for parking, but more the impacts of parking, the policy we've had for generations on our cities, the sprawl, the increased costs, the reduced housing affordability, and in general, a lot of externalities around parking policy. This comes at a core. Ian mentioned this up top, but we're talking about this in the bill. Parking mandates. These are arbitrary ratios that say for every kind of land use, building, business, you have to provide a certain amount of state determined parking. These vary widely across cities, as mentioned. We know that these are arbitrary because back in the 1950s, when they were put in place, the planners who were deciding them said so. It's doubtful if any two planners or architects can agree on the amount of parking. There may never be a correct answer. We just guess the number of stalls, and either it's too many or not enough. And that would have been fine, except that planners then took these rules, what they could have been making with tarot cards or bird guts, and wrote them into city code, which expresses itself in how our cities have been built since they went into place, large parking lots. Just to hammer home how arbitrary these are, this is a small city in Georgia called Woodbury, very low population. They've got two significant figures on parking mandates for hospitals and high schools. This place has different parking requirements for heliports and helistops. Two kinds of helicopter parking. Hell if I know what the difference is between these things. And to top it off, we've got, and these are not, I've got a whole stack of these, but SeaTac Washington has parking mandates for butterfly and moth breeding facilities. No word on if there are for worm buckets or ant farms. Now, this is funny, but it's not a laughing matter. These parking mandates are part of the zoning code, which is like the DNA of our cities. This is expressed in how our cities are built. We end up with places that are hostile to walking and biking and taking transit, places that cause environmental degradation, places that are relatively easy to get to, but no one really wants to go to anymore. This is terribly expensive, and it's real dollars. When we're talking about how much a parking space costs, and these costs vary widely, the best thing is to go ask someone who built something, but a new surface stall with landscaping, etc., costs thousands of dollars. Above ground parking costs tens of thousands of dollars, and below ground parking costs about twice as much. Real money. $10,000 of construction costs is $100 in rents that needs to be made up. So if you're spending $40,000 on a parking space in an apartment, that's going to add about $400 to the rent that someone has to pay. The space is tremendous, 300 to 400 square feet per stall. Many cities, most cities, in fact, require 1.5 to 2 parking spaces for every apartment in the United States. We're requiring about as much space for parking as we are for living. Architects will tell you they frequently will go and figure out how much parking they can put on a spot and then build the amount of housing that the parking can support, not the height limit for the building or what the city needs, just how much parking, how much housing can they build based on the amount of parking that they can affordably fit or relatively affordably fit on the lot. Meanwhile, this is just an example from La Crosse where I gave a presentation recently. Most renter households in the country own 1 or fewer cars. So if you have a single parent, for example, with 1 or 2 children, and they don't want to all sleep in the same room, they're probably going to have to rent an apartment that has 2 or 3 parking spaces. So and if you multiply those costs, even from the surface space, you're quickly adding up hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars in additional rents, which if there is housing available at all, which often there isn't due to the difficulty in building with these mandates in place. Parkingreform.org is our website. You can go to resources, parking lot map. We've done a survey of hundreds of cities in the United States looking at their downtowns. So when we talked about the expression of this, many of our downtowns are 20 to 30% parking. The lots, this is a buildable land. They're either surface or garages. And these are kind of often the best example. Many of these downtowns don't have onerous parking mandates anymore, but the demand from all the mandates around the downtown keep a high demand for people to drive in. And these lead to places that aren't walkable and are just generally hostile to meeting a lot of our goals. If you look at how we used to build things, they were main street walkable places. You could drive once, take a bus, walk to your main street. You could go to, get a haircut, go to a jewelry store, maybe get lunch, meet someone. These are the places that we love to go to, and that we, have replaced kind of with indoor shopping malls or other places sometimes. But most cities have an area of old Main Street downtown that looks like this from built before parking mandates. After parking mandates, it's like the picture on the bottom. There's probably the same number of businesses in both of these photos. They're just way spread out. So if you want to go to the business in the lower left on the bottom photo and then have to go to the one in the upper right, you're probably either going to drive or have a very bad time walking across a hot parking lot. There are other externalities of these. They undermine our goals, reducing VMT to city centers, that's vehicle miles traveled, increasing walk and transit and bike mode share, housing affordability. We want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we care about public health and the environment. But the existing parking supply already supports the traffic we have. Building more for cars diverts money that we could spend for other modes. More parking does mean less housing, and transportation sprawl are great major greenhouse gas contributors. Parking lots are a cause of heat islands, urban flooding, and water and light pollution. Fortunately, there's a solution out there. Professor Shoup, as mentioned, has a 3 steps to better cities, and the Parking Reform Network is here to help you implement them where you live. What is the Parking Reform Network? We are a community where practitioners, activists, and partner orgs get together to have fun, support one another, and advance parking reforms across the country. We provide research, advice, other materials to help you with this, and we are focused on action, not just showing the bad pictures of sprawling parking lots and parking craters, but helping you actually to communicate with policymakers and partners, coalitions in your community to fix this. One other this is happening across the country. We have a map where we track where parking mandates have been eliminated in cities and other municipalities across the world. There are more than 65 cities in the United States, mostly in the last 5 years, that have eliminated parking mandates citywide for all uses. You can see them on the mandates map that you can find on our website. These are all across the country in red states, blue states, places with snow, places with heat. We just added Longmont, Colorado, right in the middle of the country. So it's rapidly advancing. It's not just cities doing this, though. Since 2019, 22 states have introduced parking reform legislation. A lot of it hasn't passed, but you try and then you try again. This includes the bill we mentioned in Minnesota, the People Over Parking Act. But there have been successful bills in California. Oregon has a number of bills and has done some interesting statewide reforms. Not even on this map. I learned about something that's in place in Michigan that helps cities get rid of mandates. And recently, like about a month ago, Colorado signed a bill into law that is going to rapidly advance parking reforms in that state. Parking Reform Network exists because it's not just minimums, though. Removing mandates is like removing the rocks and weeds from a place you want to have a garden. You can't just go throw plants, vegetable seeds on your lawn and hope a garden grows. You have to remove the bad stuff first. So removing the parking mandates doesn't actually change a lot. It just allows your other policies to work better. There are many other policies cities need to undertake, like managing their on-street parking, upzoning, etc., and we assist with that. To that point, one main thing is cities should mind their own business when it comes to parking. They own the curbs and they should manage them. I know there's often concerns, well, the developers will build with no parking and spillover will happen. Cities can manage their curb with simple pricing techniques that send the proper signal. Instead of telling every entrepreneur or developer or tenant or landlord or customer how much parking they need, you can manage your curbs and then send the proper signals so that people build the amount of parking and make the right choice or purchase the amount of parking that they want for themselves. You can then spend any revenue you have on great things like sidewalks and crosswalks, better lighting, transit passes, bike lanes, and bus shelters. At our website, we have a resource, a parking benefit guide for activists that shows you how to, walks you through the process of helping your city implement better parking management and directing that money to be spent on things that improve walkability and general great things in your city. There are always many concerns around equity, aging, and disability, and that's something that we also are trying to convene and take head on. The main message here is listen to the communities involved here. We convened a roundtable about 1.5 years ago that was pretty great. I have a link and some notes that you'll see on the next slide, where the real message was this is not a monolithic community. There are trade-offs we're making to mobility. When you add mobility for people in cars, you actually often make it more difficult for other people to get around. But this is a complicated question, and we're continuing to tackle it. The Parking Reform Network is convening a work group to build an equitable parking policy framework, and we're going to have a summit this summer, this fall, hopefully in the Bay Area to present that. So it's definitely a concern, and we can continue to talk about it, but just to know it's not something that we ignore. If you want to work on parking reform in your city, I encourage you to check out our website. I made a link so you can sign up for our mailing list or become a member. I put links to the resources, including that webinar on equity, disability, and aging in there. We are here to help. We are here to help you make messages. I give presentations to city councils or community groups all the time. Just honestly, having a community, a network of people that can support one another and answer questions is also fantastic. We have a very active Slack. So I would say if you think that you want to remove barriers to more housing, walkability, other modes, and work on climate change, this is a great place to start. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Tony, Omar, and Chris, for those opening remarks. Tony, that's so cool that you mentioned that Longmont, Colorado has just enacted parking reform. Literally minutes before I came on this webinar, I was talking to my colleague from Walk to Connect, who lives in Longmont, Colorado, I believe as a member of the Planning Commission there. And she said, hey, Longmont just passed parking reform. So that was the first I heard, and then you mentioned it right here. So I'd love to now introduce another colleague, Arliss Reynolds. I first met Arliss in 2019 when she was a fellow in our National Walking College program. At the time, she had just been elected to the City Council in Costa Mesa, California. Since then, she's been re-elected for a second term. She's also become a member of the America Walks Board of Directors and very engaged in all of our campaigns and programming. So Arliss, I'd love for you to just kind of talk about your experience with parking mandates and parking reform, and then maybe transition us straight into the Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And thank you, Chris, Omar, and Tony for those presentations. I come to this from a perspective of someone who's not a planner, and before I became a council member, didn't have any real knowledge or expertise in this area. Someone who certainly wants to support building healthy communities, and as a council member in position to make the right or wrong policies to get to those goals. And I think probably like many, especially many who grew up in a car-centric area, certainly had the default position that parking is good, right? Of course, we want people to be able to park in front of their homes. Of course, we want to support business by making sure that there's parking in front of businesses. But over the 6 years on council, I feel like I've just run into so many examples of impediments that parking creates to really important, valuable, necessary community benefits. That started with my walking college walking action plan, right? Wanting to work on getting safe road infrastructure like bulb outs implemented and bike lanes implemented. And there was concerns about removing parking from the street to get that infrastructure in place. On the business side, a locally owned ceramic studio found a great building they wanted to expand into, and they couldn't because it didn't provide enough parking. The coffee shop, my favorite coffee shop, which is now ranked #1 in Orange County, they will tell you they almost didn't open because they struggled to meet the minimum parking requirements. We had an organization that was ready to donate an indoor sort of a soccer court and donate for free with lighting and everything. And we couldn't find a space that would have the parking to support it. We want to expand park space in some of our neighborhoods that don't have it, but we're limited by the need to provide parking with those parks. On the housing front, we have an organization building a 100% affordable senior housing project. And we've asked, how can we get more units on this project? And they say, well, like, we're limited based on the number of parking spots we need to provide. And most recently, I'm working with a developer who's wanting to build some housing now. They showed me their plan and I said, okay, where do the neighbors gather to get to know each other, right? How do we build a neighborhood in this community? And they said, well, there's no space because we need to provide parking. In that list, I could probably go on for a couple hours, you as well. And it's just remarkable how much we don't have because of parking requirements. So I wanted to ask each of you if you have a, what's your either most distressing or most your favorite story of how parking mandates have either harmed a person or project opportunity, or how removing it has really opened up an opportunity. And let's go in order of the presentation. So I'll start with Chris.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Sturgis, South Dakota. That's where the motorcycle rally is, for people who know that. It's a town of about 6,000 or 7,000 people, and it has a really nice downtown Main Street. But that Main Street is illegal to rebuild under parking minimums. And I had a friend who wanted to start a coffee shop, like you said, Arliss. And he looked into what different things he would need to do. And he was looking at health and all these other things first. But then when he looked at the zoning, he realized that the parking was going to be a big impediment. And this was even though there were lots of large surface parking lots nearby that are only ever full during the rally that we have for 2 weeks in August. And the rest of the year, it's totally empty. But once he learned about all the different things that he had to do, and that was one factor among many, but he just decided to give up and then never went forward with this project.
Yeah, Omar.
Yeah, thank you. So in South Minneapolis, there's actually a church in my district called Calvary Lutheran Church that wanted to convert most of its space into affordable housing. If the previous parking minimums had been in effect, there would have been no possible way for them to make that conversion because there isn't space nearby for it. The congregation probably, I believe, would have had to demolish the building, not by choice, but because they would have had to do it. Thankfully, Minneapolis had already gotten rid of parking minimums. So in this case, there was a happy ending, but they were also able to build 41 new affordable housing units while also preserving their congregation space for their community. So that was a victory that we can point to in South Minneapolis, right near George Floyd Square.
The example that touches me the most here was actually uncovered by Katie Gould at Sightline. When she was looking into Oregon's reform, she interviewed a woman named Melissa Bruce in Beaverton, Oregon, who ran an adult foster care facility. Sorry, it's a really sad story. Her home had room so these are like homes where people who, often elderly people who are transitioning in hospice care, get them out of the hospital or get out of a nursing home and have them in a place that's, a family will take care of them, traveling nurses. It's a really critical need for housing in our society. This woman had room for 12 people in her home, but because of the parking mandates in Beaverton at the time, she could only house 5 people in her house. Now, the crazy thing here is that I believe there were 5 parking spaces mandated by the city to use all 12 of the spaces that she could provide. And actually, on her site, she had a 2-car garage, I believe, and a 3-car apron. The concrete out front, the driveway. But one of the things is, even when cities require parking, they often require parking to be certain specific kinds. So actually, ironically, or maybe not, because anyone who has a garage can tell you they usually don't park in it, the garage spaces didn't count towards the requirement. And I believe that one of the parking spaces on the apron also didn't count. So even though she had 5 parking spaces on site, she couldn't count them all, was not able to open these spaces. tried and tried, and then finally, actually, Beaverton recently got rid of parking mandates, and Oregon, actually eliminated them for this land use. But the reform came too late. This business is now closed. So this is like a business and a housing critical need for housing where these mandates prevented. Probably caused great societal harm, and it's a tragedy. It's part of what drives me to work on this.
Yeah, and I hadn't intended to answer this question, but your story, Tony, just reminded me when I lived in Columbia, Missouri. There was a young man who opened a daycare and after-school care program in his home in a very low-income, predominantly African-American neighborhood where this was such an important need. And he got the business license to do this. He was making it very affordable. And after he had been operating for some time, there was a complaint and the city investigated and they served an order for him to close down immediately because he didn't have enough parking spaces on his property and this is on a great wide road, a great overbuilt residential road with plenty of on-street parking. Anyway, as I recall, there was a big advocacy effort, and it turned out he could appeal this to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and he managed to get a waiver. But there was a huge threat over this very much needed business because of these parking mandates, and he had to put a lot of time and work and money into fighting this in order to stay in operation. So I want to pivot a little bit to the politics of parking reform, and I'm going to ask you, Senator Fateh, first this question, since you've been right in the middle of it for the last 6 months or so in the Minnesota State Legislature. How does support or opposition to parking reform align with political leaning, conservative or liberal?
Yeah, that's a great question. This was one of the most interesting bills I've carried because we got support from people with very different ideologies. When we had the committee hearing for it in state and local government, I presented it jointly with a Republican colleague of mine, Senator Jordan Rasmussen, who I asked to sit with me and speak on the bill as well. And another senator, Senator Jaskowski, actually came out in committee in support of the bill and said that it was the first time he supported something that SEIU was backing. So we formed a very unique coalition around this. People come to this issue from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different angles. And for myself and Chris, for example, the biggest reasons why we cared for this about this issue is because of climate action and housing affordability. But in a lot of the conversations we're having with some of our Republican colleagues who seemed interested in the bill, they were also interested because of caring about things such as property rights, free markets, and libertarian values. So with them and in committee, I continuously highlighted the fact that this bill is a 100% libertarian bill, and that with this legislation, all we're saying is that individual property owners are the ones who are best positioned to determine how much parking they need, and not governments. And I think that really sat well with them.
Chris?
Yeah, I think he covered it pretty well. I mean, it's been really interesting to see such a unique coalition, seeing labor unions like SEIU, environmental organizations like the Sierra Club and Move Minnesota, affordable housing organizations like the Minnesota Housing Partnership, to be in alignment with a lot of the most conservative senators. And there was an article from the Center for the American Experiment in support, Cato Institute. So it really does bring a lot of very interesting partners together.
Right. Tony, do you have a perspective on this?
Yeah, I think there is something in parking reform for everyone. Most people just don't know about it yet. And what we've seen in other places across the country is sometimes it is the more progressive or liberal side that is opposing this for certain reasons. I think a lot of there's a broad political support. I mean, the support comes from many areas, and the opposition comes from many areas, and often just depends on locally who brought it up and who likes them and who doesn't. Or I also think a lot of the opposition is based on who benefits from the status quo, right? Businesses that are on a main street that use the street parking may oppose these reforms because they don't want competition to come in and challenge their business, that it might use up the parking. Or developers, in fact, who have a business model that builds parking may not be that interested in new builders coming in that have different business models that might be more walkable, that might compete with them. So I think a big thing here is just education, and that there's a lot of, we've seen a lot, this happens around the country, and there's a lot of promise. So it's just really keeping at the messaging and letting people know what we're actually talking about. We're not removing parking. We're not banning parking. We're just trying to kind of right size things and allow better things to happen.
Yeah, thanks for those answers. It is interesting thinking about this from a local elected perspective, where we are, nonpartisan. It is nice to have issues that are very bipartisan, right? So it's great to hear that there is the reasons to support it, not just for the local arguments, but also from different political arguments. I'm curious that the experience in Minnesota, and then of course nationally, Tony, as you're tracking this across the country, what have you seen? We need electeds at the local level, at the state level, to create this legislation, support this legislation. What have you seen in terms of the political ramifications? Do people who support this work, are they getting supported in their runs and re-elections? Does it seem politically dangerous? What can you share from what you're seeing around the country? Maybe we'll start with Tony, and then we can get the Minnesota experience.
I haven't heard many examples of where this has led to, like, I think depending on your timing and how the issue gets portrayed, it can be politically risky, and how you communicate it. It is worth knowing that it takes a long time for things to change, right? You pass parking mandates, and I was just in Austin a couple months after they got rid of their parking reforms. They got rid of their parking mandates, and it's the same city, right? The places still exist. So I think that a smart city will prepare for this by projecting confidence and saying, look, we can pair these reforms with planning and policy to manage issues as they come along the horizon. Try not to fall into a culture war around this. Like, we're really just trying to remove a little bit. And I think it could be okay, but it's relatively new. And as far as I know, there hasn't been like a whole council thrown out. We've in fact seen parking reforms be more politically durable than other types of land use reforms in places like Gainesville, Florida, for example. So,
Senator?
Yeah. So in our experiences, actually, we've received overwhelmingly positive feedback since introducing this bill, and that's something that I didn't necessarily expect. I thought there would be significantly more opposition, but the vast majority of calls and emails that we've been getting has been just enthusiastic support for it. Constituents and Minnesota residents have been asking for updates on the status of the bill, why they support it, and how they can help us push for it, and things like that. So we also had many of my colleagues reaching out, wanting to learn more, as it was the first time for a lot of them, just like myself, hearing about this issue. The main opposition that we've had this year had come from the League of Minnesota Cities. And I think that their main concern was just losing their existing power. In our talks with them, they indicated that they actually do not, they're not against the policy. They actually are supportive of the policy itself, but they just don't want to lose the local control aspect. And that's one of the main negatives that we've come across. And some of the concerns that my colleagues have addressed to us was that local control piece that they've been hearing from the league.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on that? Because I want to make sure I understand the local control argument. Is that the using parking minimums as a way to sort of a lever to control projects and development?
Yes, so they want this policy, if it's set by local jurisdictions, not by the state.
Got it. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. they would basically say like, you know, that they would often encourage their local cities to adopt policies like this, but they didn't want the state to be mandating that. And I guess my response to that is I agree that there should be local control, but it should be in the hands of the builder. Like, and if one size fits all is bad policy, it's bad policy for the cities to be doing it as well. But yeah, aside from the League of Minnesota Cities, there hasn't been very much opposition at the state level. And my experience on the Planning Commission was also surprising to me because, you know, I've been on my local neighborhood association since 2011, and parking is one of the most frequent things that people talk about. And our former mayor of Minneapolis, Betsy Hodges, said that one of the biggest surprises that she had when she came into office was how much time she was spending about parking. And so I really expected that when we brought this policy forward to have a lot of really intense opposition. But then it passed by an overwhelming vote when we made the reform in 2015. And then when we went all the way to fully eliminate parking minimums in 2021, I kept expecting to see the people who are always calling for more parking, you know, every time there's a planning commission project, to come out against the policy. I mean, and you know, there were news articles and press releases about it. We did a press conference on it, so it got plenty of attention. And I kept expecting to see the opposition, but there wasn't a single person, not one, who came to speak against it. And I don't really know why that is, why there was such a contrast between the individual projects, which would often get lots of opposition based on parking, compared to the overall policy where we didn't. But that was the case. And I've heard in other places that they've had similar experiences where if you really change the policy whole scale and get people to think in bigger picture terms, that's a key thing. Like when it's just an individual project, they're just thinking about that. But if we can get people to think about broader goals of climate action and housing affordability, that seems to really make a difference.
Yeah, that question of state overreach is something that I was very familiar with as a city council member in Columbia, Missouri, where the state of Missouri legislature prohibited us in Columbia, a much more liberal politically city than the state as a whole, from various things that we wanted to do that were progressive, and I have an instinctive negative response to the idea of sort of state mandates overreaching. But this is different because it's a state law to stop government overreach at the local level. And I thought that Chuck Marohn expressed it very well at your opening announcement about this legislation, Omar, back in January. Chuck Marohn, as many people know, is the president of Strong Towns and lives in a small town not too far from Minneapolis. And normally Strong Towns does not endorse legislation, but this was so important to the mission of Strong Towns to get some traction behind an effort that he came to that event and spoke up in favor of it and wrote about it. The point he made was, yes, we could do this city by city by city, and persuade and educate and get those local officials to make the policy changes necessary. But it would take an enormous amount of effort on the part of those of us who understand the issue well, and it would take an enormous amount of time, in which time so much more harm will have been done. So a state law prohibiting these mandates makes tremendous sense, and I certainly agree with that. So
Yes. And do you mind if I jump into one more
yeah,
thing?
go ahead.
I apologize for interjecting, but
No, it's good.
one of the things that we also saw, or at least I saw myself, was um, some misinformation or misunderstanding about what the actual legislation is. I've had not just staffers, but constituents reaching out to me saying, hey, we heard about this bill that you want to get rid of parking. You're going to eliminate parking. And time again, we had to say, no, we're not eliminating parking. We're eliminating parking mandates. There's two different things. We're not getting rid of parking. We're simply saying, let the people decide, the developers, the builders, property owners, XYZ, how much parking is needed. That's it. So just clearing up that misunderstanding once we walked them through that and clearly stated that, I think that more and more folks were on board than not.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, and people do jump to that wrong conclusion that you're prohibiting people from building parking. No, the property owner, the builder can put as much parking as they want in. We're just not going to tell them they have to build a certain amount.
Well, I mean, I will push back on that just a little bit, because in Minneapolis we did start. We do have some parking maximums on the upper end. Because in Minneapolis we are trying to be more climate friendly, and you know, it doesn't affect very many projects, but when a project comes that wants to build an excessive amount of parking, we do have some restrictions on that. So, you know, and that has been an issue that some of the GOP members, you know, don't like that part of it. And so, you know, that's a difference from where people are coming at this. You know, in Minneapolis, we're coming at it from primarily a climate angle and housing affordability angle.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Chris. So parking maximums are a thing as well. They're not very common at the moment, but they can be beneficial in my view. Want to go to Tony. I know that there are a lot of members of our audience today who are working on various progressive policy campaigns around mobility and safety and transportation and climate and so on. What advice do you have for local groups working on parking reform in their own communities, or people who maybe haven't done this before but are looking to enter the space?
Absolutely, thanks. Well, of course, parkingreform.org. Go check out the website. Join PRN if necessary, or of course, but also just start becoming informed and talking about it. Organizing is connecting, that is education, agitation, you know, and organizing, you know, multiplying yourself. So you want to connect the dots of what parking reform. There's so many things. In a way, it's like making lemonade out of lemons. There's so many bad things about parking that that it impacts whatever community groups you're in. You know, if you're in an America Walks chapter, or if you're a bicyclist, or, you know, anything regarding access, mobility, just point out to people and encourage your organizations to become a little, the organizations you're affiliated with and the people you hang out with, to become a little more informed. Be patient and prepared. A lot of our success stories come from a couple dedicated folks making these kinds of connections and just sticking with it, and then striking when the iron is hot, when the policy comes up, you know, providing that little oomph to your city council or the support to the planning commission to get it over the edge. So really, I think the main thing is just connect with the community and help raise awareness, because ultimately most people have not considered many of these impacts.
Chris?
Yeah, I think one of the most impactful things people can do is just contact their legislators and council members and planning commissioners and any people who are decision makers about this, and just bringing the issue to their attention makes a big difference. And we've really seen you know, the contrast in policymakers between ones that had constituents reach out to them and the ones that haven't had that yet. You know, this is something that a lot of them haven't really thought about it, but if you bring it to their attention and connect it to broader issues around climate action or housing affordability, free markets or property rights or whatever it is, you can really make a big difference. And it's a small number of people that can make a difference. Like just one or two people can really have an impact. So for all of the other people listening in on this, you know, think about, like, have you reached out to your legislator yet? Like, do you know them? Call them, email them, try to get a meeting, and try to make this happen.
Anything to add to that, Omar?
Yeah, I think one of the most impactful things you can do is get a clone of Chris or Tony and get to work. But in all seriousness, I think it really does make a huge difference when people reach out to the legislators, especially on an issue like this, where oftentimes we won't know anything about it at all. So it helps when there's a ton of people reaching out, not just speaking to the issue, but educating their legislators on it as well. That's very helpful. So for everyone that's out there who wants to see this reform happen, you can get better acquainted with who your legislators are, call them, email them, show up to their town halls, and ask for a meeting. Just being persistent. We know that oftentimes they probably won't get back to you right away, but if you keep at it, they will. On this webinar, we know that we have a whole lot of people, and if each and every one of you call them, send in a letter to the committee, or yeah, to the committee or to leadership, or send an email. That would definitely raise the pressure on this, and that is one of the most impactful things that you can do, is just staying persistent, reaching out, and getting to know who represents you, and continuously staying in contact with them.
I want to build on this question a bit. We have a few questions from the audience about these outreach and engagement strategies, whether it's your state legislator, your mayor, your city council, or broader community. So we're hearing loud and clear, like, go straight to your policymakers, start a conversation with them, get them understanding and talking about this topic. Are there any other successful outreach strategies that you would encourage, maybe especially in a community that doesn't have sort of an ongoing conversation about planning and transportation? Or I'll add to that, when in a America Walks Walking College, certainly reaching out to your policymakers is one type of action that they encourage. If you don't get a positive response from your policymaker, for example, right, there's a lot of discussions about then, okay, you've got to go to some community organizing. So I'm curious if maybe you have some examples of that where you had to start get the engine running, maybe a bad analogy, but get some momentum building to then take to your policymaker to say, hey, I've got some support behind this. Any suggestions for our audience here?
Yeah, I mean, I approached it by trying to build support among my neighborhood. That's why I joined the neighborhood board, and I had lots of conversations with the board members there, and talked about our common goals of supporting the local businesses and trying to make housing more affordable, and just built the support from the ground up. And then also reached out to various organizations that had goals that were compatible with it. So started with the Sierra Club and MN350 and other climate organizations, and drew attention through that way, and just tried to talk to people about their concerns, about how we can use different management mechanisms to regulate the parking that we already have without needing to push for more. And as we built that grassroots support and had people bringing it up, then it got through to the elected officials.
With a few minutes left in our webinar, I'll ask you each, and I think this is related, being sort of embedded in this discussion and having lots of experience talking to a lot of different people, I'll ask you each, starting with the senator, to give us your 30-second elevator pitch, where you're trying to, pitch a colleague or pitch someone in your community on this topic. Why should we eliminate parking minimums?
Absolutely. People come at this issue for a lot of different reasons. But one of the main reasons that I took this issue on was because I was really persuaded that it was really important for us to do everything we can to reduce carbon pollution and improve housing affordability. If those are goals that we want to accomplish and we want to get serious about it, then it doesn't make any sense to force people to build more parking than they need. And that's That's it.
Don't build more parking than we need. Chris.
So my pitch would be different based on who I'm talking to. If I'm talking to someone who's climate, then I would focus on that. But we've had a lot of conversations with more conservative people who aren't as concerned about that, and to them, I just emphasize this is a free market issue. This is a property rights issue, and more than that, it's a small town livability issue. Like, think about your small downtown Main Street and the community that builds. Don't you want to see more of that again? Well, you need to understand that it's illegal to do with parking minimums.
When I learned about the parking policy and the impacts it has, I realized quickly that there was no better way that I could spend my time personally than to work on parking reform, because it impacts housing, transportation, and climate change issues that I care deeply about. Fixing these rules kind of unpaves the way for a better future, where it makes like these walkable and livable places more possible, and allows the policies and efforts we have to combat these big problems to actually work. So it's just a great way to spend your time and resources.
I want to thank you all very much, Tony, Senator Fateh, Chris, and Arliss, for sharing your knowledge and passion for this issue over the last hour. I also want to give a shout out to U.S. Representative Ilhan Omar, who was originally going to be on this panel, but was unable to join us in the end. She is a co-sponsor of the federal legislation to eliminate parking reforms within a certain distance of transit stations. So this is happening at all levels of government. So just moving us to our wrap up here. There we go. Please consider donating to America Walks to support the webinar programming that we perform, and that link, I think, again, will be in the chat if you want to give it a click now and make a donation. And I want to just give a quick heads up for our next America Walks webinar. It's going to take place on Tuesday, July the 9th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Pedestrian fatalities in Indian country, responding to a crisis. And our panelists will include tribal government leaders, planners, and activists focused on the excessively high pedestrian fatality rate in communities of Native Americans and Alaska Natives. With that, thank you very much for attending this America Walks webinar, and we will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.